Paul Ritis. I'm chair of the music department at Northeastern University. I'm also jointly appointed in the DeMoore McKim School of Business in the Innovation Entrepreneurship Group. Basically, I brought a panel together, the opening panel of the day, and even though I didn't moderate the panel, it was kind of the panel's my concept, and it's the result of my research that I've been doing in this particular area. I'm in a variety of different things, right, but this is the one related to how a study of art and culture can stimulate creativity, and how that creativity can then be a metaphor for creativity and innovation in business, whether it be new products, new services. Well, I think the thing that really got me moving in this area, I mean, I'm an artist, right? I have a PhD in music composition, computer applications in music from the University of California, Berkeley, right? But then I started working in interdisciplinary teams. I came to Northeastern University and got an MBA, right? And so suddenly I saw that my creativity was somehow allowing me to do things differently in the business world and creating things that these guys weren't talking about, or they were thinking about. And at the same time, when I was learning business, I was learning about a confidence and recognizing that I can apply what I do in a different way, that in fact maybe I do have something to bring to the table. I think that analogy is actually increasingly empowered in today's world. Perfect example was something that came out, but was called GMAC. I think it's General Management Admissions Council, or something like that. And the other ones who oversee like the GMATs for people who want to go to business school. But they also are the organization that really provides recommendations for business school education in the United States at the undergraduate and graduate level, and it recognizing that there's not enough outside-of-the-box thinking, too much narrow, you got the blinders on. Undergraduate school business programs are very strong, and then students do that. Then they go, we got to get an MBA. We need that credential, and they end up just kind of continuing to be narrowly focused, undergraduate in business, graduate in business. So they made a request, basically, to the arts, saying we need to spend more time looking at the arts as a metaphor for creativity in business, as a metaphor to allow us to step outside of the box. They say artists step outside of the box. Innovators need to do more outside of the box thinking. Can one influence the other? And that's an opportunity for me because I straddle that intersection, right, between arts and business. First of all, when you start going to culture, there's the culture of people in business and the culture of artists. And trust me, I mean, the minute I got in my MBA, suddenly, a lot of my art colleagues think I got twice as dumb, right? And so it's amazing some of the prejudice against doing anything that's industry-facing whatsoever. They feel as if these constraints that somehow just, wreck one's creativity. But in the same way, once I got an MBA, suddenly people who were in business felt like I joined a club, or at least it appeared to me like as if I joined a club. And now suddenly the ideas that I had before my MBA somehow now have meaning to them. But it's been trending for the last couple of years. No doubt that Apple had a big part of that. Was one of the big reasons for that. The role of design and the arts. I guess Steve Jobs was in ceramics or some class that he did that kind of made him think differently about the world. And that's increasingly trickling, I would say, at an accelerating pace. There was a company called IDEO, still out there, IDEO, right? 2 engineering professors out of Stanford basically looking at design as a way of influencing the way we think about creativity in business. And now at Stanford they have what's called the D School. You have design and business taught at the same time. I refer back to a professor of mine at Bucknell University, undergraduate professor in philosophy, a guy by the name of Richard Fleming. Richard Fleming, one of my great important mentors, Richard Fleming did a paper called The Calling of the Interdisciplinary in the mid-'80s. And he was looking at 4 scholars, Leonard Bernstein, Stanley Cavell, philosopher at Harvard, John Cage, and Wittgenstein. And basically throwing these guys together to see what one can teach the other. And we're going to get to some new meaning, some new deeper understanding. For me, I've been ripping off phrases from his paper for years. And the most important thing he said to me was that we can place disciplines side by side to see what one can teach the other. And that's what one of the big things that this design thinking process does. It basically says, well, if you have 2 people of the same ilk in the same room, chances are you're not going to get a new perspective on something. So let's bring in people from different disciplines. When I was at the University of California, Berkeley, I was at a center there called the Center for New Music and Audio Technologies, CINMAT. And at CINMAT, it wasn't just musicians. My mentor there, David Wessels, got a PhD at Stanford from psychology of mathematics. I still don't understand what that means. But the idea that somehow we can learn about psychology through mathematics, or that we can learn about mathematics through psychology, is fascinating. And what he did, he loves the drums. So he decided, I'm going to start a new research center, right? Center for New Music and Audio Technologies. So you have psychologists, mathematicians, musicians, computer scientists, people that are dealing with cognitive psychology, artists, engineers, and we're building things, right? What they're doing is placing these disciplines, people from disciplines side by side to see what one can teach the other. At the same time, when you do that, you have to have, one of the things that Fleming really pointed out is that professors, they don't like to look stupid, right? And so the minute you step outside your home discipline, right? Like, I'm not a mathematician, but as soon as I step outside of music to learn a little bit about math and to suggest that I might have a new perspective on math, professors don't want to look stupid. There's a whole lot of math I don't know and will never know or ever understand, no matter how much time I put into it. But learning just a little bit about math and then might give me a different way of looking at what I do in music. And to have that courage to step outside of what you feel expert in order to learn a little bit of something, what do you know, that's often where you kind of look back and get a new perspective on that area. And that's something that interdisciplinary study provides. Well, why just disciplines? Why not cultures, right? So what happens when you bring two cultures together, people who look at the world completely differently, you put them in the room, cultural mashup. You hear about digital mashups, it's a cultural mashup, right? What happens when you bring these people together? How can they teach each other? So another aspect of design thinking is, looking at extreme users or looking at different cultures, putting them together. Somehow, any way you can to find a different perspective in a safe environment for communication in order to come up with a new way of looking at the world. So it's not just an IDEO thing. It's not just a design thinking thing. Mutual exchange of ideas. All these really wonderful basic concepts that now are increasingly, well, from my perspective, come from the arts, which you find in terms of collaboration, embracing failure. In a string quartet, you hear for years, oh, string quartets, some people are followers, some people are leaders. Well, you know what, there's something to that, right? And if you study music all your life and you look at a problem, you will look at it differently than someone who's never looked at music looks at a problem. So now, particularly with the strength from GMAC saying, it's okay to look towards the arts to stimulate new ways of thinking, it's very exciting. It's a great position for me, but I really do think it stimulates innovation, innovative thinking. There's a difference between incremental and disruptive innovation. I think it's one of the things that were being discussed earlier this morning. And in fact, there was a moment where he said, incremental innovation actually can be quite profitable. It can be quite useful, but it's probably not going to be it might be a thing that sustains a company for a long period of time, but at some point, the disruptive technology is going to come and wipe that company away from the earth, so to speak. So I would say sometimes yes, sometimes no, right? There's something about appropriating that is purely incremental versus something that is completely different. But I honestly believe that they're both valuable. Same thing with music composition. Stravinsky loved to talk about how, good composers borrow, great composers steal, right? Or the idea of or in another way, if you study someone's work, if my hand should accidentally hit the piano when I'm composing on a key that I didn't intend it, but I like it, I'd be a fool not to take it. This process of discovery and experiment and things happening by accident also needs to be embraced. When you talk about Apple versus Samsung, I think one of the things that the United States is beginning to learn is that there are many different ways of moving forward in innovation. Right? Apple would focus on something very narrow and spend a lot of time doing it and only do one thing really well and as well as possible. It's been very successful for them, obviously. But you know what? There's another way of doing it. What Samsung does is it just basically look at every possible thing you could possibly get involved in and just go after it all at the same time. It's very mafioso in a way. It's just like any business we can make money and we're going to get into. And how efficient can you really be, right? But turns out that they're doing amazing things. And actually, lots of agencies seem to be working that way. And lots of people in the United States start to say to themselves, what can we learn over there? I think one of the interesting things about design thinking and certainly about a country like China, where they're increasingly, they just look towards the West, look towards the United States. How much can they learn and bring it back? The United States needs to start doing the opposite. Right? We need to start saying to ourselves, they do things that are very interesting. What can we take from them and bring it back here? The whole notion of mutual exchange, I think, is really the most important thing. I mean, the fact of the matter is, I've worked with UNESCO quite a bit. In particular, an NGO affiliated with UNESCO. UNESCO is the United Nations Education, Science, Cultural Organization. There's an NGO called Melodies for Dialogue Among Civilizations Association. Right? The idea that we can place musicians together and that music is a means of communication, and that, music is a universal language. And let's just all work together and make music. Well, you know what? Music is not the universal language. Right? There are language barriers. There are systems. Different cultures have different systems of making music. There's different tuning systems. There's so many different ways that are barriers to these musicians working together. But what we all do have, right, are ears, right? And we hear things, and we also have curiosity. At least some cultures maybe more than others. But when you place musicians from different cultures side by side to see what one can teach the other, that's going to be my phrase, happens over and over again, you find that a desire to work together begins to move forward. And that idea, what UNESCO or this NGO does suggest, is that if you bring these musicians together, even though it might not be so much, it's a universal language, but people who want to make music together tend to not want to blow each other up, right? So it's a peace thing. But any way that you can find a means to communicate and learn from another culture, you're going to find that it's going to be a safer environment for creativity. And I think that's what excites me about this kind of cultural exchange, particularly with the arts. You mentioned this idea of appropriation, and it's not quite that simple. I do a lot of work in China. I started working with Chinese traditional instruments back in 1999, having no idea that a Long Island Italian was going to spend a great deal of his time writing music for Chinese traditional instruments and going out there and talking about it and actually publishing and selling my music in China. At least that's the direction I'm working towards with the Central Conservatory of Music in Beijing. They're like, hey man, Chinese people are less interested in playing the music of their own composers. They're interested in these Western composers. What are they saying for these instruments that have been around for 3,000 years? But there was an interesting situation where I composed a piece of music. I studied the Chinese music. I was studying Chinese music. I was trying to learn from it. And then I wrote an instrument for this instrument called the pipa. And then I had it performed in China. And then someone from the audience says, wow, it was very interesting, the Japanese modes that you used in creating this piece of music. I don't know any Japanese modes. I was just doing what I thought was cool. But there was a message. When they heard it, they heard something very different than what I heard. So it's interesting. They both thought it was innovative, but the way they both take it in the marketplace, you got to be a little bit careful. So it's appropriation. Let's just say it's a path, right, towards thinking differently, a la Apple. It's a path towards communicating. It's a path towards stimulating ideas. But when I compose music for Chinese instruments, I'm not composing Chinese music for Chinese instruments. I'm composing American music for Chinese instruments. What's freeing about that is I don't come to those instruments or that culture with 2,000-3,000 years of baggage. In this sense, I mean, I'm free to be able to not have any codes I'm going to break. Now, it might cause a little problem here and there, but in the end, it's still a fresh and new approach to what's going on. I think this is a subtle difference between what appropriation is, because there's a certain amount of intent with appropriation. I'm really interested in experimentation. I think that's really what I'm grabbing onto. I think there's a difference. There are two things that are happening, and I didn't quite get to it when I was talking earlier, but there's about 7 or 8 years ago, a guy by the name of Daniel Pink came out with an article where he basically said the MFA is the new MBA. And, of course, it created all kinds of ire. I remember going to the Harvard Business School and saying that the MFA is the new MBA, and everyone was like, yeah, good luck with your MFA compared to my Harvard MBA. But that said, there's been these interesting trends, and that is that many of the major, this is 5 or 10 years now, many of the major consulting firms, McKinsey & Company, Boston Consulting Group, they are now, whereas they used to hire 80% of their new employees with PhDs in the sciences or MBAs, they are now, so that's down to 40%. Increasingly, they're hiring people with MFAs, also PhD in history, other disciplines, recognizing that they need a broader group to rely on for really new problem solving, really good problem solving. And I just met a perfect example. In fact, Northeastern is trying to seal the deal on this guy named Dan Lavallo, who is a McKinsey consultant for many years in Australia. He took a step back, and he just got his MFA in sculpture, right? And we're trying to get him here. He's also very interested in design thinking, and so excited about the possibility of collaborating with him. So I'm a guy who started out with his advanced degree in music and then got an MBA. Here's a guy who started out, I believe he's a PhD in economics, right? Worked as a McKinsey consultant for years, and then goes and gets his MFA in sculpture and new media art. And what happens when you bring those things together? That's very exciting to me. So the answer is yes, it's happening.
Excellent.